The Cold War was a long period of tension and rivalry between two powerful nations, the United States and the Soviet Union. It lasted from the end of the Second World War in 1945 until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Unlike earlier wars, the Cold War was not fought mainly through direct battles between these two superpowers. Instead, it was fought through political pressure, military buildup, intelligence operations, economic competition, and smaller conflicts in different parts of the world. It was called cold because the United States and the Soviet Union never fought each other directly in a large traditional war, yet the fear of conflict shaped global history for nearly half a century. To understand how the Cold War began, it is important to look at the end of World War II. In 1945, Nazi Germany was defeated in Europe, and Japan surrendered later that year. The war had caused enormous destruction. Millions of people had died, cities were ruined, and economies were shattered. Two countries emerged from the war stronger than others. The United States had a powerful economy and military. The Soviet Union had suffered terrible losses, but had built one of the largest armies in the world and controlled much of Eastern Europe. Although the United States and the Soviet Union had been allies against Nazi Germany, their relationship was based more on necessity than trust. The United States believed in capitalism and democracy. In this system, businesses are privately owned and citizens vote for their leaders. The Soviet Union followed communism under the leadership of Joseph Stalin. In this system, the state controlled industry and land, and political power was concentrated in a single party. Even before World War II ended, tensions were growing. At conferences in Yalta and Potsdam in 1945, leaders from the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union discussed how Europe would be reorganized after the war. They agreed that Germany would be divided into zones controlled by the Allies. Berlin, the German capital, would also be divided. However, disagreements soon appeared about the future of Eastern Europe. As Soviet forces had pushed westward against Nazi Germany, they had occupied countries such as Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia. After the war, instead of allowing fully free elections as had been discussed, Stalin supported communist governments in these countries. These governments were loyal to Moscow. Over time, opposition political parties were removed or suppressed. In 1946, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave a speech in which he said that an iron curtain had descended across Europe. By this, he meant that Eastern Europe was cut off from the West and under Soviet control. This phrase became one of the most famous descriptions of the division of Europe. The United States responded with a new policy known as containment. This policy aimed to prevent the spread of communism to other countries. In 1947, President Harry Truman announced what became known as the Truman Doctrine. He declared that the United States would support countries resisting communist influence. Soon after, the United States introduced the Marshall Plan, a large economic aid program designed to rebuild Western European economies. Billions of dollars were sent to help repair industries, infrastructure, and trade networks. The goal was to create stability and reduce the appeal of communism. The Soviet Union saw these actions as attempts to expand American influence. In response, it tightened its control over Eastern Europe and created its own economic and military alliances. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, known as NATO, was formed. It was a military alliance between the United States, Canada, and several Western European nations. Members agreed that an attack on one would be considered an attack on all. The Soviet Union responded in 1955 by creating the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance among Eastern European communist states. Europe was now clearly divided into two opposing blocs. One of the first major crises of the Cold War occurred in Berlin. After World War II, Germany was divided into East Germany under Soviet influence and West Germany under Western influence. Berlin, located deep inside East Germany, was also divided into East and West sectors. In 1948, the Soviet Union blocked all land routes into West Berlin, hoping to force the Western Allies to abandon the city. Instead of giving up, the United States and its allies organized the Berlin Airlift. For nearly a year, planes flew into West Berlin delivering food, fuel, and supplies. At its peak, a plane landed every few minutes. The airlift successfully kept West Berlin alive, and in 1949, the Soviet blockade ended. This event strengthened Western unity and deepened mistrust between the two sides. The Cold War soon expanded beyond Europe. In 1949, the Chinese Civil War ended with a communist victory led by Mao Zedong. The establishment of the People's Republic of China worried the United States, which feared the spread of communism in Asia. In 1950, war broke out on the Korean Peninsula. Korea had been divided after World War II into North Korea, supported by the Soviet Union and China, and South Korea, supported by the United States and its allies. In June 1950, North Korean forces invaded South Korea. The United Nations, led mainly by American troops, intervened. China later entered the war on the side of North Korea. After 3 years of fighting, the war ended in 1953 with an armistice, meaning a ceasefire. Korea remained divided near the 38th parallel. The Korean War showed that the Cold War could turn into violent conflict through proxy wars. At the same time, a new and frightening development changed the nature of global politics. In 1945, the United States had used atomic bombs against Japan. For a few years, it was the only country with nuclear weapons. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb. This began a nuclear arms race. Both sides developed more powerful weapons, including hydrogen bombs, which were far more destructive. The possibility of nuclear war created a constant sense of fear. Leaders understood that a direct conflict could destroy entire cities and possibly human civilization. This concept became known as mutually assured destruction. It meant that if one side launched nuclear weapons, the other side could respond with equal or greater force, leading to catastrophic consequences for both. During the 1950s, tensions rose and fell. In the United States, fear of communism led to investigations and accusations against suspected communists in government, entertainment, and education. This period, often associated with Senator Joseph McCarthy, became known as McCarthyism. Many careers were damaged by suspicion and fear. In 1953, Joseph Stalin died. His death led to changes within the Soviet Union. Over time, new leaders such as Nikita Khrushchev introduced some reforms and criticized some of Stalin's harsh policies. However, the rivalry with the United States continued. By the late 1950s, the Cold War had become a global struggle involving alliances, military bases, intelligence agencies, propaganda, and competition in science and technology. The world was divided, and each side watched the other carefully. The tension was steady and powerful, shaping decisions in governments across continents. The next decade would bring some of the most dangerous moments in the entire Cold War, when the world came very close to nuclear conflict and the balance between the superpowers was tested in dramatic ways. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Cold War had become a global struggle that affected nearly every continent. Both the United States and the Soviet Union continued expanding their influence, building alliances, and strengthening their militaries. The fear of nuclear war was always present, even during times when there was no active fighting. One of the most important areas of tension remained Berlin. After World War II, Germany had been divided into West Germany, supported by the United States and its allies, and East Germany, controlled by the Soviet Union. Berlin, the capital, was also divided. West Berlin became a symbol of freedom and economic success, while East Berlin remained under strict communist control. Many people living in East Germany were unhappy with their political system and economic conditions. They saw West Berlin as an escape route. Between 1949 and 1961, millions of East Germans left their homes and moved to West Germany through Berlin. This created a serious problem for the East German government and embarrassed the Soviet Union. In August 1961, East German authorities, with Soviet support, began building a wall around West Berlin. This structure became known as the Berlin Wall. It was made of concrete, barbed wire, guard towers, and armed patrols. The wall physically divided families, friends, and communities. People who tried to escape risked being shot. The Berlin Wall became one of the most powerful symbols of the Cold War division between East and West. At the same time, the Cold War extended beyond Europe into other parts of the world. One of the most dangerous moments occurred in Cuba, a small island nation near the United States. In 1959, a revolution in Cuba brought Fidel Castro to power. Castro established a communist government and formed close ties with the Soviet Union. This alarmed the United States because Cuba was located very close to its mainland. In 1961, the United States supported an attempt by Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro. This operation, known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, failed. Cuban forces quickly defeated the invading group. This failure strengthened Castro's position and pushed Cuba even closer to the Soviet Union. The following year, in 1962, the Soviet Union secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. These missiles could reach major American cities within minutes. When American reconnaissance aircraft discovered the missile sites, the United States reacted immediately. President John F. Kennedy announced a naval blockade around Cuba to prevent additional Soviet weapons from arriving. This event became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 days in October 1962, the world stood on the edge of nuclear war. American and Soviet forces were placed on high alert. Both sides prepared for the possibility of conflict. Fear spread across the globe as people realized how close humanity was to catastrophic destruction. Behind the scenes, leaders from both sides communicated carefully. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev eventually agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba. In return, the United States agreed not to invade Cuba and secretly agreed to remove its own missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended peacefully, but it left a lasting impression. Both sides realized the dangers of nuclear confrontation. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, efforts were made to reduce the risk of accidental war. A direct communication line, known as the Hotline, was established between Washington and Moscow. This allowed leaders to communicate quickly during emergencies. Another area where Cold War tensions turned into active conflict was Vietnam. Vietnam had been a French colony, but after World War II, independence movements grew stronger. The country was eventually divided into North Vietnam, supported by the Soviet Union and China, and South Vietnam, supported by the United States. The United States feared that if South Vietnam fell to communism, other countries in Southeast Asia might follow. This idea was known as the domino theory. Beginning in the early 1960s, the United States increased its military involvement in Vietnam. American troops were sent to support South Vietnamese forces. The Vietnam War became long and difficult. American forces faced guerrilla tactics from North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters. Dense jungles, unfamiliar terrain, and strong resistance made the war challenging. Many soldiers and civilians died. The war also caused deep divisions within the United States, where many people protested against military involvement. By 1973, the United States began withdrawing its forces. In 1975, North Vietnam captured the southern capital of Saigon, and Vietnam became unified under communist control. This outcome was seen as a major setback for American Cold War policy. At the same time, the Cold War was also fought through competition in science and technology. This was known as the space race. Both the United States and the Soviet Union wanted to demonstrate their technological superiority. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into space. This shocked the United States and showed Soviet scientific capability. In 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to travel into space and orbit the Earth. The United States responded with increased investment in space exploration. In 1969, American astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first human to walk on the moon. This achievement was seen as a major victory for the United States in the space race. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, both superpowers continued building nuclear weapons. They developed intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of traveling across continents. They built submarines capable of launching nuclear missiles from underwater. Bombers were kept ready at all times. Despite these dangers, there were also efforts to reduce tensions. This period became known as détente, meaning relaxation of tensions. Agreements were signed to limit nuclear weapons. Leaders visited each other's countries. These steps helped reduce immediate fears, but mistrust remained. The Cold War continued to influence politics, military strategy, and daily life across the world. Nations aligned themselves with one side or the other. Conflicts in Africa, Asia, and Latin America were often influenced by Cold War rivalry. Although direct war between the United States and the Soviet Union never occurred, their competition shaped the lives of millions of people and created one of the most tense and dangerous periods in modern history. By the early 1970s, after decades of intense rivalry, both the United States and the Soviet Union began to understand the dangers of their constant confrontation. The Cuban Missile Crisis had shown how close the world could come to nuclear destruction. Leaders on both sides realized that if tensions continued rising without limits, the consequences could be catastrophic. This understanding led to a period known as détente, which means a relaxation of tensions. During détente, both sides made efforts to improve communication and reduce the risk of nuclear war. One of the most important developments was the signing of arms control agreements. In 1972, American President Richard Nixon visited the Soviet Union and met with Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. This visit was historic because it showed that the two superpowers were willing to cooperate despite their differences. During this visit, they signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, often called SALT I. This agreement limited the number of certain types of nuclear weapons each side could possess. It also included the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which restricted systems designed to shoot down nuclear missiles. This was important because both sides understood that if neither could fully defend against nuclear attack, neither would risk starting one. This balance helped maintain stability. At the same time, economic and cultural exchanges increased. Scientists, athletes, and artists traveled between the United States and the Soviet Union. Trade agreements allowed limited exchange of goods. These interactions helped reduce some hostility, though political differences remained. However, while tensions between the superpowers eased slightly, the Cold War continued through smaller regional conflicts. One important example was in the Middle East. After World War II, tensions between Israel and its Arab neighbors led to several wars. The United States generally supported Israel, while the Soviet Union supported several Arab nations. Although the superpowers did not fight directly, their involvement influenced the balance of power in the region. Another important region affected by the Cold War was Africa. As European colonial empires collapsed, newly independent countries emerged. Both the United States and the Soviet Union tried to influence these nations by offering economic aid, military support, and political backing. In countries such as Angola and Ethiopia, civil wars became connected to Cold War rivalry, with each superpower supporting different sides. In Latin America, the Cold War also shaped events. The United States feared the spread of communism in countries close to its borders. It supported governments that opposed communist movements, sometimes even when those governments were authoritarian. The Soviet Union and Cuba supported revolutionary groups in some regions. These struggles created instability and violence in several countries. By the late 1970s, détente began to weaken. Distrust grew again between the superpowers. One of the most important turning points came in 1979 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Afghanistan was a country located near the southern border of the Soviet Union. Its government was facing internal conflict, and Soviet leaders decided to send troops to support the communist government. The Soviet invasion alarmed the United States. American leaders saw it as an attempt by the Soviet Union to expand its influence. In response, the United States provided support to Afghan resistance fighters known as the Mujahideen. These fighters used guerrilla tactics to resist Soviet forces. The war in Afghanistan became long and difficult for the Soviet Union. Soviet soldiers faced harsh terrain, strong resistance, and difficult living conditions. Many soldiers were killed or wounded. The war became unpopular within the Soviet Union, and it placed strain on its economy and military. At the same time, tensions increased in Europe. The Soviet Union deployed new nuclear missiles in Eastern Europe. The United States responded by placing its own missiles in Western Europe. This led to widespread public fear and protests. Many people were concerned about the possibility of nuclear war. In the United States, President Ronald Reagan took a strong position against the Soviet Union after becoming president in 1981. He increased military spending and introduced new defense programs. One of these programs was the Strategic Defense Initiative, sometimes called Star Wars. This plan aimed to develop technology to defend against nuclear missiles from space. Although it was never fully implemented, it increased pressure on the Soviet Union. Reagan also described the Soviet Union as an evil empire, reflecting the deep mistrust between the two sides. The Cold War appeared to be entering another dangerous phase. However, inside the Soviet Union, serious problems were growing. Its economy was struggling. Industrial production was slowing. Agricultural output was insufficient. Many people faced shortages of basic goods. The cost of maintaining a large military and competing with the United States placed heavy strain on Soviet resources. In 1985, a new Soviet leader named Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. He recognized that change was necessary. He introduced reforms known as glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost meant openness. It allowed more freedom of speech and transparency in government. Perestroika meant restructuring. It aimed to improve the Soviet economy by introducing limited market reforms. Gorbachev also believed that reducing Cold War tensions was essential. He met with President Reagan several times to discuss arms reduction. These meetings helped build trust and led to important agreements. In 1987, the United States and the Soviet Union signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. This agreement eliminated an entire category of nuclear missiles. It marked a major step toward reducing nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, changes were spreading across Eastern Europe. Communist governments that had ruled for decades began losing control. People demanded political freedom, economic reform, and democratic elections. The Cold War was entering its final phase. The system that had divided Europe and shaped global politics for nearly half a century was beginning to weaken. Soon, events would unfold that would bring this long period of rivalry to an end. By the late 1980s, the Cold War was approaching its final stage. The Soviet Union was facing serious internal problems that made it difficult to continue competing with the United States. Its economy was weak, and many industries were inefficient. Factories produced goods slowly, and shortages of food and everyday items became common. People often waited in long lines to buy basic supplies. The government struggled to provide a high standard of living. Mikhail Gorbachev, who became the leader of the Soviet Union in 1985, understood that reform was necessary. He introduced policies designed to modernize the country and improve life for its citizens. His policy of glasnost allowed people to speak more openly about problems. Newspapers began reporting issues that had once been hidden. Citizens could now criticize government failures more freely. His second major reform, perestroika, aimed to restructure the Soviet economy. Limited private businesses were allowed. Managers were given more control over production. These changes were meant to increase efficiency and innovation. However, the reforms also created uncertainty. The old system weakened faster than the new system could replace it. At the same time, Gorbachev made an important decision about Eastern Europe. For decades, the Soviet Union had used military force to maintain control over communist governments in countries such as Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia. In the past, Soviet tanks had crushed protests to keep these governments in power. Now, Gorbachev chose not to use force. He believed that each country should decide its own future. This decision had enormous consequences. Across Eastern Europe, people began demanding change. In Poland, a labor movement known as Solidarity pushed for political reform. In Hungary, leaders began opening borders and allowing greater freedom. In East Germany, protests grew larger as citizens demanded the right to travel and vote freely. One of the most powerful symbols of the Cold War was the Berlin Wall. Since 1961, it had divided East Berlin and West Berlin. It represented the separation between communist Eastern Europe and democratic Western Europe. For nearly 30 years, it stood as a barrier between two different political systems. In November 1989, massive protests took place in East Germany. Thousands of people gathered, demanding freedom and reform. The East German government, unable to control the situation, announced that citizens would be allowed to travel freely. Crowds rushed toward the Berlin Wall. Border guards, unsure how to respond, eventually allowed people to pass. Citizens from both sides climbed onto the wall. They celebrated together. Many began breaking the wall apart with tools in their hands. This moment became one of the most important events of the 20th century. The fall of the Berlin Wall symbolized the end of communist control in Eastern Europe and the weakening of the Soviet Union. After this, communist governments across Eastern Europe collapsed one by one. Poland held free elections. Hungary transitioned to democracy. Czechoslovakia experienced peaceful protests known as the Velvet Revolution. East and West Germany reunited in 1990, becoming one country again. Inside the Soviet Union itself, change accelerated. Different regions and republics began demanding independence. National identity became stronger in places such as Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Ukraine. These republics wanted to govern themselves rather than remain under Soviet control. The Soviet economy continued to decline. Inflation increased. Government authority weakened. In August 1991, a group of hardline communist officials attempted a coup to remove Gorbachev and restore strict control. They sent troops into Moscow and tried to seize power. However, the coup failed. Citizens protested in the streets. Boris Yeltsin, a political leader in Russia, stood in opposition to the coup. His resistance inspired others. The failure of the coup further weakened the Soviet government. By the end of 1991, the Soviet Union could no longer continue as a single country. One by one, its republics declared independence. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. It broke apart into 15 independent nations. Russia became the largest successor state. This event marked the official end of the Cold War. The United States remained as the world's only superpower. The global rivalry that had lasted nearly 50 years came to a peaceful conclusion without direct war between the two main opponents. The end of the Cold War changed the world in many ways. Europe was no longer divided into hostile blocs. Germany was unified. Eastern European countries began building democratic governments and market economies. Many nations that had been under Soviet influence gained independence. Military tensions between the United States and Russia decreased significantly. Nuclear arsenals were reduced through new agreements. The constant fear of sudden nuclear war that had existed for decades began to fade. However, the Cold War left lasting effects. Many countries that had been battlegrounds for proxy conflicts faced long recovery. Political tensions did not disappear completely. New challenges and conflicts emerged in different parts of the world. The Cold War had shaped global politics, technology, and society. It had driven scientific advancements, including space exploration. It had influenced education, military planning, and international alliances. It had affected the lives of millions of people across continents. For nearly half a century, the world had lived under the shadow of rivalry between two powerful systems. Its end marked the close of one of the most significant chapters in modern history. The lessons of the Cold War continue to influence international relations, diplomacy, and the pursuit of peace even today.